Hello and welcome to my lecture review using the JBL book, Risk Management Fundamentals. This book is written by Gibson and Igonor. It's again, Managing Risk in Information System, 3rd edition. It is a Jones and Bartlett book, ISBN number 9781284183719. Again, they own all the copyrights. All I am doing is preparing lecture review for the PowerPoints that they own the rights to. So with that said, let's jump in and let's see what we can do. All right, chapter 1. This is going to be risk management fundamentals. So we're going to be looking at the components of and approaches to effective risk management within an organization. We're looking at key concepts. Let me grab my pen. Risk and the relationships to threats, vulnerability, and assets, asset loss. We're going to be looking at classifying business risk in relation to the 7 domains of typical IT infrastructure. We're going to be looking at risk identification techniques, management process, and strategies for handling risk. So those are our key areas that we're going to be focusing in this fundamentals chapter. So first question is, we have to learn some terminology. Language is important when we're talking risk. So the big 5 we have to look at is risk, threat, vulnerability, assets, and loss. Risk, likelihood of an event occurring. Now normally we're looking at risk in terms of loss. So we could also word that likelihood that a loss will occur. And that normally happens when a threat exposes a vulnerability that could harm an asset. So you're going to notice threat, vulnerability, asset, loss. So we have to define these key terms. A threat, any activity that represents a possible danger. So again, this doesn't mean an actual or one that's occurred. This could be anything representing a potential danger. Vulnerability, typically defined as a weakness. Asset, it can be tangible or intangible, but it's something that has value that needs some form of protection. If we're talking a tangible asset, could be a computer, phone, car, house. An asset could also be an intangible item, something that you can't touch, branding. Though normally we are looking at assets as a physical item, they don't always have to be. Last is loss, and loss results in a compromise to business functions or assets. And those are, again, both tangible and intangible. So these are the key terms that are going to make up how we operate in this chapter. All right, so what are some risk concerns? Since we're talking business functions, so what are some of these risks? Well, compromise of the business function, compromise of business assets, anything that will increase the costs for the business, and basically we're looking at profitability versus survivability. So are the costs and revenue, are the costs going down and the revenue going up? These are all key concepts that, well, directly relate to risk. So let's look at threats, vulnerability, assets, and impact. When we look at our confidentiality, integrity, availability, our triad, threats can be thought of as an attempt to exploit a vulnerability that should result in loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability of a specific asset. One thing to note is our goal, let me grab my pen again, is if we start here in the middle, as we move towards one side, we move away from the others. So to make things incredibly available, we are going to be farther from confidentiality. So again, when we're looking at our CIA, confidentiality is basically ensuring and preventing unauthorized disclosure of that data, what's ever being protected. Integrity is about making sure the data is not modified in transit, storage, process. Availability is ensuring that data is available when authorized users actually need it. Vulnerabilities, again, it's a weakness. A loss to an asset occurs when someone exploits that weakness. And exploit normally is, again, the realization of that weakness. So exploiting is the realization of a vulnerability. Vulnerabilities can exist and, well, nothing can happen. Vulnerabilities could exist and then something bad could happen. Just because there's a vulnerability does not mean that it's going to be exploited. Sometimes they go unnoticed, or sometimes they go noticed real quick. It really just depends. So there isn't a firm, fast rule with that. Vulnerabilities can also exist if security is weakened, either intentionally or unintentionally. You could lower protection and by accident increase your exposure to that weakness. Assets, tangible, or devices, computers, networks, data. Intangible, again, reputation, branding, influence. So that's what I meant by our assets being tangible and intangible. It really just depends on what you're trying to measure. And again, you can have things very difficult to measure, like branding and reputation. How do you measure that? How do you quantify your reputation? Well, there is an assessment, a calculation for just that. Impact typically is done through a very low to very high, using a Likert scale of 5. Very low, low, moderate, high, very high. And we normally can rank them, indicates multiple severe or catastrophic adverse effects. High is just severe, moderate, some, low, limited, very low, negligible. Again, our goal here is to minimize risk exposure, but that doesn't necessarily mean eliminate. Our goal is typically to get them down low. All right, so let's look at classifying business risk. So, risk posed by people, by process, by technology, again, it really just depends. So, risk posed by people, that could be bad managers, users, developers, bad system admin. You could also have just bad processes, policies, standards, guidelines. Actually, I have an example of this. I actually work with a nonprofit, and we actually had really bad donation practices. So the process for a company donating through our nonprofit, well, we didn't think of certain scenarios, so a company donated through us, and we didn't handle it very well. So we actually took on risk of damaged equipment and actually had to incur all the responsibility. Turns out that was because we had risk that we opened ourselves up to because of a bad process. And so after that, we redefined our policies and procedures so that it doesn't happen again. Again, sometimes the lack of a process could also just be a bad process or just a process that wasn't developed. Then again, risk posed by technology. The 7 domains within the technology that we're going to be focusing on throughout our book is the user domain, workstation domain, LAN domain, LAN to WAN, WAN, remote access, and application. These are the 7 domains that our author is going to keep referencing. Again, these are going to be on LAN. This is going to be connecting our LAN to our WAN. This is everything within our WAN, remote access, and then all software and applications. So it's all about balancing. It's about balancing security and usability. We have a teetering bar. So if we want more security, then typically usability is a little lower. We want high usability, security is a little lower. Again, you go from one side to the other. So the closer we get to this side, the farther we get from the other side. So in this example, we are increasing our security. That means we're getting further away from usability. So again, it's all about the balance that is appropriate for your organization. All right, go back to those domains. So we have our user, our workstation, our LAN, our LAN to WAN, our WAN, our applications, our remote access. These are going to be brought up over and over and over again. So what are some of the techniques to identify risk? You could identify the threats, the vulnerabilities, or you can estimate impact and likelihood of a threat exploiting or realizing a vulnerability. Sometimes we can look for the threat. Sometimes we can look for the weakness. And both of those allow us then to figure out the impact and likelihood of that threat realizing that vulnerability. And I use the word realizing because that's really what exploiting is. It's finding the weakness, the vulnerability, and then actually doing something with it, realizing the weakness. So again, we have to identify them, and some of the ways we do that is looking at sources. So if we're talking threats, they could be inside threats, external threats, natural or man-made. Natural could be, depending on context, maybe the threat could be a tornado. It could be, flooding. It could be a tsunami, depending on where you're at. Again, threats can be accidental or intentional. Our vulnerabilities, again, could be ways of identifying them: audits, accreditation, logs, previous events that never been fixed, reports, or they could be found through some form of incident response or reviewing of potential incidents. It really just depends. But those are common ways to identify both threats and vulnerabilities. Again, all of this goes back to we have to balance our risk. And eventually we will be talking about calculating our risk, but we're not quite there just yet. We're getting close, but we're going to work on some concepts first. So balancing the risk, consider the cost to implement a control and cost of not implementing the control. If it costs $1 million to implement a control and what you're protecting is worth $100,000, but if you don't implement the control, it might cost you $10,000 if it's realized. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to pay for the control if the cost of not implementing it is appropriate, or if the risk is low. So again, it's about balancing. Spending money to manage a risk rarely adds profit. It typically decreases profit. So you have to make more business sense because the business needs to operate. The cost to manage a risk might balance against the impact. We have to look at what's reasonable. And reasonable is defined as, would a reasonable person be expected to manage this type of risk? Or would a reasonable person do said item? Again, we have to understand that risk management is about balancing likelihood and costs in terms of what is reasonable. All right, so now let's look at some of the numbers. So threats could be a high threat, medium threat, low threat, low or a high low threat. It could be, a more likely. So again, when we're looking at the threats, they're going to have a likelihood percentage. And then what we could do is we could look at the impact. So we will take the let me grab a pen. Impact times likelihood. And that's going to give us our threat likelihood. And sad part is, risk management is all about calculations of risk. So you're always going to look at what percentage of likelihood. And again, they may change. This might be 19%. And it might be a somewhat between low and medium impact. And so you'll have to figure out, maybe this was a 15 impact times our 19% to give us our threat likelihood. So risk management is looking at and managing risk, threats, and vulnerabilities. Their intersection is where risk management comes in. Again, we look at assessing the risk, identifying, quantifying it. Is there a risk? Is there a strong likelihood of occurrence? Identifying the risk, the types of risk. Selecting the appropriate control. Again, that's an important one. You don't want too high of a control or too little of a control. You want an appropriate control. Implement, verify, and then lastly, evaluate. That way you can identify if it's the correct control. And if not, then you go back to, so we go this process. And you evaluate and reevaluate as many times as necessary until it's an appropriate control. I keep using very specific language like appropriate control, mainly because it's about balance. Why? Because, again, the business has to function. There's not an unlimited amount of money, so there has to be some form of cost-benefit analysis that proves that the control is appropriate. So we have the principle of proportionality, and we have a cost-benefit analysis. Basically, the principle of proportionality states the amount spent on a control should be proportional to the risk. So if the risk is high, you can spend a little more. If the risk is low, then you don't pay for it. Or you lower what you're going to be spending. We also have our cost-benefit analysis, our CBA, that helps to determine which control and countermeasures to implement based off of the appropriate costs. Again, if the cost is too high and the potential is low, you're not going to be throwing money away. Profitability versus sustainability. You have to look at what are the costs. Out-of-pocket costs, lost opportunity costs, future costs, confidence costs, client and stakeholder confidence, and total cost of security. Again, money doesn't grow on trees, so we do have to find a way to balance our costs so that profitability and survivability are appropriately balanced. All of this goes back to risk management and the varying techniques. We're going to dive deeper in the varying techniques, but right now the 5 main strategies are: you avoid risk or you transfer risk. When possible, you mitigate risk. Then there's also residual risk. And lastly, sometimes you just accept it. There's nothing I can do. So you can just accept the risk and see what happens. These are the main 5 strategies or techniques for risk management. And again, we're going to dive into these 5 in later chapters a lot more in depth. All right, that's all I had for this chapter. Thank you. Alrighty, well, thank you. That concludes this lecture review. Again, all material presented in this PowerPoint lecture was copyrighted by Jones and Bartlett Learning. So they own the copyright. I am just providing a lecture on the PowerPoints that they provided. With that said, if you have any questions, thoughts, issues, concerns, please feel free to reach out to me, leave a comment, get in touch with me, and I will get those addressed as quickly as I can. Thank you.